And now we're going to hand over to a guest who's with us just for a short time, Ida, and I'm quite sure, Ida, I'm going to pronounce your surname incorrectly. So I would like you to introduce your full name, Ida. And I will just say that Ida's visiting us from Norway, and she's working with Professor Susie Garvis. And she'll be talking today about early childhood teachers' judgments of children's language skills, which is such a critical part of their learning. So Ida, I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen here, and luckily it will work. If I do this, can you now see my shared PowerPoint?
Yes,
okay. So my full name is Ida Wiik Sætherskar. So it's a bit of some weird sounds that you don't have. And I'm from Nord University in northern Norway. And as you can see on the map, we have several campuses. And I live and work in Bodø, which is our second northernmost campus. And I'm also part of a Center for Research on Special Needs Education and Inclusive Practice called SpedAims. And I'm currently working on my PhD in special needs education. So I'm going to start a bit with contextualization, because there might be some differences between Norway and Australia that might be relevant to know about, and also a bit of a context behind my PhD and the first article that I'm going to share with you today, which is a meta-analysis. So in early childhood, a lot of children struggle with their language and communication development. And in Norway, early childhood education teachers, they have a responsibility to both monitor, identify, and support these children. And they are also essential in referral to special needs or speech therapy services. So almost all referrals are made through the teachers. But in Norway, assessments are very highly debated, and some are so strongly against it that they do not assess anything in early childhood. And one of the core arguments against assessments is that skilled teachers do not need assessments to identify those who struggles. However, a very new report from Dyslexi Norge, they have shown that 2 out of 3 teachers have not learned anything about DLD, which is developmental language disorders. And 50% are unsure if they can identify signs of developmental language disorders. In addition to this, a previous report from the same organization has shown that in Norway, about half of children with DLD are identified at the age of 13 or later, which is very late. So with all these topics or points in mind, I wanted to investigate how accurate teachers are when they evaluate or judge children's language skills to best support the children who need help, and also the teachers who should identify and support these children, which is then the topic of both my thesis and the first article that I'm going to share with you today. And the first article is a meta-analysis, and it's looking at teacher judgment accuracy. And judgment accuracy is defined by Südkamp as the correlation between teacher judgments and students' test performance. So we have the teachers, for example, ratings of language on one hand, and then we have the children's test performance on an objective or direct clinical measure. And then we kind of compare these and look at the correlation between them. And that is what is defined as the teacher judgment accuracy. So our first aim was to investigate that across a lot of studies. And then the second aim was to look at if there are any factor or characteristics that influence this correlation between these two measures. So if there are things related to the teachers, such as their education or experience or training, that can influence this. If there are things related to the child themselves, such as their age, their gender, if they are multilingual or monolingual, things related to the test. So if the test is a standard measure, is it a test with good reliability? And also things related to how the teachers give their judgments. So are they rating a child like on a general basis? Is it on a rating scale? Is it a dichotomous, like, yes, he has a problem, no, he doesn't have a problem? So all things kind of related to how and what the teacher are judging. The last aim was to look if there were any publication bias or bias from studies with high risk of bias. In addition to this, we complemented the analysis with a more systematic review where we looked at sensitivity, reliability, and specificity of the tools used to evaluate the children's skills. So what we did was that we searched for studies that reported on the correlation between teachers' judgments and children's language performance. And we did that by combining search word related to setting, so kindergarten, early childhood, preschool, and so on, words related to judgment, so rating, perception, evaluation, and language. And that could be like vocabulary, syntax, oral language, expressive language, and so on. And then we searched in 6 different databases and ended up with a total of 4,093 studies after removing duplicates that we read through title and abstract, and then 154 that we read full text, and a total of then 35 studies were included in our total review. However, when we looked through these studies, they included both samples that were unselected, samples with clinical populations, and samples who were mixed. And then we chose to do the meta-analysis, so the quantitative synthesis on the unselected sample, which is 26 studies. So the meta-analysis focuses on those unselected samples, while the more systematic review focuses on all the studies. Then we did something called the Correlated and Hierarchical Effects model, which tries to account for dependencies in the data. So some studies that reported, for example, more than one correlation. So this is a model that tried to kind of account for the biases in that. And then we did a funnel plot and Egger-stats to test for publication bias. The results from our meta-analysis, they show a moderate and statistically significant correlation of 39, which is fairly good and shows that teachers are fairly accurate at judging children's language skills. And this was, as I said, based on the 26 studies, but 98 effect sizes. And the results also show quite high heterogeneity across the studies. As you can see, the boxes are and the lines are quite wide. However, when we tested the moderation analysis, which was these different characteristics that I wanted to test if they kind of influences the correlation, none of these characteristics moderated this correlation. So if the teachers had more or less experience, didn't necessarily affect this. The age of the child didn't necessarily affect this. And the reliability of the tools used didn't affect this. However, our analysis has quite low power, so it's a more of exploratory analysis. So the results need to kind of be interpreted a bit with caution, and there might be that the lack of kind of significant results is low power and not necessarily a lack of actual relationships. When we did the publication bias analysis, there was no substantial bias revealed. And also after we removed studies with high risk of bias, the results kind of remain stable, which is good. But then we also did more of a systematic read-through of the studies. And when we did that, the review that we did indicates some instances of judgment inaccuracies. For example, for teacher and child characteristics, there were quite a few studies who looked through this. For teachers, not that many, only 3 studies. And 2 of them did not find any kind of effect for teaching experience and teaching education level. That means that if teachers had a high level of experience or a low level of experience, they were kind of equally accurate when they judged the children's language skills. However, one study did find that teachers who were trained in assessments and received training in doing this were more accurate when they evaluated the children's language skills. For the child characteristics, there were a bit more studies looking into this. Quite a lot of them looked at child gender, and which is perhaps not so surprising, because gender and language has kind of been something that has been researched a lot about, but none of them found any effects, meaning that teachers evaluate the language of girls and boys equally well, which is good. For age, they did find effects, and 3 of the studies said that teachers were more accurate when they evaluated older children compared to younger children. This might be a bit problematic, seeing as we want to early identify children who struggle. But then 2 studies also said that teachers tended to slightly overestimate children who were older. So there are kind of some discrepancies in the studies. Then for language status, and language status refers to if the child speaks more than one language, so if it's bilingual or multilingual. And here the results are a bit more divided. So 2 of them said that the teachers are equally good at judging children who are bilingual as children who are monolingual. While 3 of the studies found that teachers had more difficulties evaluating bilingual children's language, even if the teachers themselves spoke both languages, so the same languages as the children. So those were kind of the more results that were easy to kind of systematize and put into a table. But then we also looked into what we call judgment objective, which is what kind of component of language are the teacher judging, because we had a hypothesis that it would be easier for teachers to evaluate expressive language, so how the children talk, than language comprehension, because you cannot necessarily see language comprehension as well as someone when you can hear someone talking. However, all the studies that looked at judgment objectives, first of all, they were sparse. There weren't that many, and all the studies were very diverse. So they kind of pointed in a lot of different directions. So, for example, for language comprehension, one said that teachers are very accurate. They're in line with the clinical assessments. Another said, no, teachers overestimate. Another, no, they underestimate. And the last, no, we didn't find any correlation, significant correlation between these whatsoever. So the results are very spread. In addition to the characteristics that we wanted to look at, the kind of more reliability, sensitivity, and specificity of the tools was interesting for us to look at. So sensitivity of a tool refers to the ability of the tool to correctly identify those who struggle, while specificity refers to the ability to correctly identify those who have normal or typical development. But only 4 of the 35 studies looked into this. And then there were 4 more who kind of reported on related aspects of this, but they did not report the same values. And also here, the ranges of the results were very diverse. So we had sensitivity ranging from 9%, so only 9% of children who struggled were correctly identified as struggling, up to 100, so everybody was correctly identified, which is kind of a large gap. And for screening tools, we often use a value around like 80. So a value of 9% is way too low. Now coming up to the kind of conclusions and implications. Even though we found that teachers were moderately accurate, there were some like tendencies for inaccuracies in the review. And given the like potential consequences and risk for children who have poor language development, we see the need for kind of teachers to strive for higher accuracy when judging children's language skills. Additionally, given these kind of huge ranges in the sensitivity and specificity, we conclude that judgments of the teachers might not be enough to identify those who struggle, but by combining kind of multiple sources of information, we can help those children in a better way. Additionally, future studies should investigate and report a lot more detailed teacher and child characteristics, because this was found lacking in the studies that we looked through. But it's important to look into further, because, for example, if teacher training is a way to increase their accuracy, then this might be a way to help more children and support the teachers' practices.
Thank you so much, Ida. That was really interesting. Great. All right. Once again, any comments or questions? Kim, thank you. We just need your mic on. We can't hear you, Kim. Anyone else while Kim gets sorted? Evie, I'm sorry, I'll ask a question while Kim's sorting out her audio. I was just curious about the actual studies that you examined in the data set. Were any of them actually based in Norway?
No. So I think almost all of them, like a lot of them, were based in the US. So this, of course, is something that needs to be discussed, because it's a different kind of system. And then there were, I think, one from Australia, one from Singapore, one from Vietnam, and then 3 more from Europe. So it's a strong overweight of studies from the US. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested in the notion of the bilingual language use amongst children, and of course the whole politics behind the Sami language in Norway.
Yeah.
And English being a dominant language in, a second official language in Norway. And so how that might have played out if you were to do empirical data analysis in Norwegian early childhood centres. Yeah. That's your next study, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Now we've got a couple of questions. Kim, are you ready? And then we'll go to Ben and Fran.
I don't. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We can.
I did nothing, right? It's just my computer decides when to work. Okay. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation and really making it clear how you did that meta-analysis. I enjoyed that. I've got some silly kind of questions, maybe that were obvious and I didn't get it. But you're talking about a very specific context, and you said there are so many children who have this developmental language disorder in your context. What language are they having trouble with?
Okay, no, the contextualization is more a contextualization of the project in a whole. So the reason for me choosing to go into this topic, but children with developmental language disorders has been found a prevalence of 7% circa in an international basis. So that is struggle with their language development.
Was that in your specific context, or you're saying globally?
Globally.
I thought you had some data on the very first slide that talked about your context.
Yeah, so the contextualization is more contextualization of my study and not my whole PhD project.
Wonderful.
That was perhaps not that clear. I'm sorry.
No, I might have missed it too. Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
Problem.
Well done.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Great question. Ben and then Fran.
Just quickly, hi. I saw in the data that you had a reference to teachers who'd had training, and given how important the language development is, not just for communicating the language, but across the whole curriculum. How much of an impact did that have, and in terms of picking them up particularly early, like in under 10-year-olds instead of over 13-year-olds, like you mentioned?
Oh, yeah, no. So the study that looked at training and assessment, that was only in early childhood. So they had a sample of teachers. Some of them were trained in assessment, some of them were not trained in assessment. So that is kind of one of the studies that we included in the meta-analysis. The point that I referred to about teachers not identifying children for 13 or older, that is a national finding from Norway that show that children are not diagnosed in Norway before the age of 13 or later, almost half of them. So that's kind of a separate, I think the contextualization might have kind of disturbed some points here. I think I may not have made that quite clear that the contextualization is more of a for the study as a whole and not this particular meta-analysis. So the studies in the meta-analysis are not related to the contextualization per se.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a bit of a note of caution from someone who's looked at a lot of American studies in early childhood, and that is they frequently use the term teacher when they're referring to people without qualifications or teaching qualifications. So I just didn't know if that had been factored in to the meta-analysis.
Yeah, and a lot of the studies, they actually write that, or I've seen some of them see that we have, when we refer to teachers, we refer to those who are employed in the kindergarten. So teacher here, and I think teacher in all of the different countries that are kind of involved in this will have a lot of different meanings.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the word teacher might not be the best use. However, that is kind of the wording that we have used though. But I get your point, and it's an important point, as you say, because some of the studies actually say that we refer to all the people who are in the kindergarten.
Which means that the knowledge base that they're bringing to any assessment or observation is going to be very, going to vary enormously. Yeah. And I might have missed this, sorry, because I did have to answer something while you were talking. But are you only looking at diagnosed, or are you looking at non-specific communication disorders?
No, so the studies here, as I said, we have unselected samples, we have clinical samples and mixed samples. So the clinical samples and mixed samples are not included in the meta-analysis. It's only the unselected samples, meaning usually just random samples of children. So there might be children who fall low on the kind of normal distribution, and there might be children on the better or higher side of the normal distributions. So in the meta-analysis, there should not be any diagnosed children, but there might be because it's an unselected sample. Yeah, the clinical samples are in another. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ida. Any more comments or questions? Ida, I have another.
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned earlier that assessment is in some ways not welcomed by educators in Norway. What do you think the Norwegian Education Department in the government would do if they read your report?
Yeah, well, I don't know. There has been quite a lot of discussions about this. And we have, since I think 2012, there has been a very high, like big media debate also, like a public debate around this. And the government actually did sort of report on the use of assessments. And I think it ended up with it's up to the kindergartens themselves to kind of support the children. So they have to choose themselves. So it means that from kindergarten to kindergarten, from teacher to teachers, their practices are quite different. But of course, I think what we want is to kind of inform that there might be ways to support, to help children. And also that the kind of judgment that we have to teacher is not only to identify children who suffer or struggle, but also to kind of help them with the pedagogical practice. Because if you are to kind of help children develop, you need to give them individualized supported help. So the judgment accuracy is not only in regards to those who struggle, but to children in general. Yeah.
Marvelous, thank you. Any more final comments or questions? No? All right. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for coming to our first lightning talk for 2025. And thank you to our wonderful presenters, Fran Press and Ida Sætherskar. And we look forward to your company in April at our next lightning talk. And have a great week, everyone. Bye.